Welcome to The East Angle, a podcast about the East, broadly defined, exploring international relations, politics, and history. When time allows, we will also delve into world events and our shared passion for football. I'm Ra Mason, and this is my co-host, Sherzod Muminov.
Welcome to the February episode of The East Angle, where Ra and I again will discuss some of the most important developments globally, with an emphasis and with a focus on Japan where possible, and then we will end as usual with football. Ra, I have a question about the thing that everybody's talking about now, the developments that everybody is talking about, and that's basically Trump and his approach to Ukraine. And I think we have to start with this because that's probably the most important thing that will define international relations for the next few years.
Thanks, Sherzod. Yeah, I think World War III. World War III?
That sounded like Russian.
Yeah.
World War III.
It's obviously happening subliminally up here. Yeah, I think it's pretty important, to say the least. What's the issue here? Is the issue that people are upset because Donald Trump is transactional and ruthless?
And you're saying they shouldn't be upset?
Yes, I'm saying they shouldn't be upset because this is A, what we really expect, and B, it may, hard as it is to palate when it's somebody that is so unpalatable, the reality is that international relations are not conducted on the basis of ethics. They've always, and always probably will be, conducted on the base of interests.
Well, I've never asked you actually if you were a proponent or an adept or what's the word? You know, you're a follower of the school of political realism.
Well, no, I'm not a realist.
Because what you just said before I asked you this question was could become a textbook kind of a quote from one of the prophets of I don't know, Hans J. Morgenthau, I don't know,
John J.
Mearsheimer or Stephen Walt.
Still, yeah.
So you're not a political realist.
I'm not a political realist. I'm not a realist in the sense that IR people talk about realism, thinking that international relations is only about material power in economic and military terms.
But then I'm actually aiming at your you are by the way the faculty ethics chair. I mean, I don't know how relevant that is. But
that
you
is
said
a controversial topic in itself, which we could have.
You said there is no ethics in international relations. I was aiming more at that point, because that's also a very political realist point to make.
International relations isn't conducted on the basis of ethics, right?
Or morals,
or
friendship, or emotions.
Well, very little. I mean, there's a great, very interesting book by a French scholar called Dominique Moissy, who looks at the emotion, the international relations of emotion, and he divides the world crudely into three parts, right? The emotion of fear, that's coming mostly from the West, US-led so-called Western liberal elite. And then you've got the emotions of hope, which comes from the East.
Huh. So sounds very Ruth Benedict to me. Sounds very, sounds very kind of essentialist.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's the point. And then the third one is the emotions of humiliation, which is the Middle East. I mean, how crude is that, right?
Yeah, very crude.
So, you have to be wary of the idea that that emotions are going to dominate international relations. They're probably not. Trump is actually quite kind of an emotional loose cannon, but he is a political realist, I would say.
Okay, so you were saying he might, in public, he might look quite unconventional, like in terms of how he speaks, in terms of what he questions. But as Prime Minister Ishiba, about whom we will talk later on, as Prime Minister Ishiba mentioned in his reflections or in his impressions about Trump, he said that Trump is a sincere man. Would you then agree with Ishiba in saying that yes, he might look one thing, but deep down, fundamentally, his worldview is still quite simple, quite based on some of the fundamentals that someone of his age, not necessarily of his political beliefs, but of his age, of his time, would hold dear.
Yeah, look, we'll park the sincerity issue, which I don't think I agree with Ishiban. But I could definitely agree with the saying one thing, doing and being another. Donald Trump is all about optics and more about optics for outputs than the other way around. People think that, well, I think a lot of people think that Donald Trump's optics are crazy, at times dangerous, that they're random. I don't think there's much random about it. There are certain things that Trump is happy to say to be provocative, but the optics are usually designed to placate or stimulate or provoke a certain audience. And the underlying policies and what goes on beyond that are really about outputs. I mean, let's look at Ukraine, right? I mean, don't you think if you look at what's going on in Ukraine, morally, ethically, you might be absolutely appalled by Trump's approach. But in terms of the outcomes, aren't we likely to see the end of conflict and a more stable situation with less people dying in the Donbass?
Well, people are dying for a reason, I think, or at least if you ask those people, they will say they're dying for a reason, or they're ready to die for a reason, because they are defending their homelands, they're defending their families, they're defending their identity and future and sovereignty. And
did Joe Biden help them to save? Did Joe Biden help to save their families?
No,
to
of course
protect
not.
their homeland?
No, but then ultimately, I think the question about Trump. One thing I might find actually quite disagreeable about what Trump is trying to do in Ukraine, having taken into account everything that you mentioned about international relations, yes, I also once in a long time ago used to study the political realism. I'm not ashamed to admit that I really considered myself a political realist up until I became a historian later on. But what is really disconcerting, and I would say actually leads us to bigger questions about where is America's place in the world, is how Trump doesn't care about Ukraine. For him, Ukraine is, he just demonstrated that Ukraine will have no say in the negotiations. Don't you find that quite
It's unsettling.
strange?
It's unsettling, right? It's unsettling, and it's morally abhorrent. And I don't think I would trust Donald Trump to tell me the time of day, if I'm honest. But does he give more of a shit about Ukrainians than Joe Biden? Probably very similar, right?
Yes,
These are not actors that are in a position to actually show empathy and help the opponent, right? So, or help the people that they're supposed to be saving or on behalf of. These are people who are fundamentally about power. Otherwise, they wouldn't have got into that.
That's totally fine with me. Maybe if I were a Ukrainian, although I'm trying to be as sympathetic to Ukrainians for many reasons, we've mentioned this before, as a fellow post-Soviet to the Ukrainians, I would say, it's not empathy that they would want from Trump, I would say they want, and ultimately they will not lose hope until Trump starts to pull all the aid and all the money or weapons, because ultimately, yes, the thing that makes him different from Joe Biden isn't the lack of empathy. The thing that will make him different from Joe Biden is he will really abandon Ukraine. And Joe Biden, for all his faults, he believed that U.S. should support Ukraine. One of several of his last acts in as a president was to sign big chunks of money and weapons and other aid to Ukraine. So I think Ukraine
is that in support of Ukraine, or is that in support of exactly the same kinds of economic interests that Donald Trump talks about?
Slightly different economic interests, I should say.
Yeah, slightly different. I mean, you're talking more leaning towards, for example, the military-industrial complex than you are towards mineral exploitation and redevelopment. But you're getting a similar kind of outcome. My concern is that we put aside our dislike for Donald Trump and think more about what kind of an environment or negotiating process we would like to see the war ended in. And I don't think anyone who has known Ukrainians, has Ukrainian friends, who has any kind of sense of history, would deny that the Ukrainians have an absolute right to sovereignty and self-determination in that part of the world. But I think we have to face a reality that you've got enormous great powers pushing up against each other, competing over resources and political influence. And it would be probably, I say probably because we can't be sure, it would probably be beneficial if we have greater clarity rather than somebody wiping their moral broad brush over what is every bit as realist policy as Donald Trump's.
Absolutely. I think you put it very kind of in a very sober way. In a very sobering, even way. I don't know. Don't ask me because I tend to disagree with you when it comes to drawing the line. When you should draw the line, when you should, ultimately, in the 1930s when Japan was stuck in China and when it did certain things that led to Pearl Harbor eventually, there were lots of voices among the conservative, or not necessarily only the conservatives, among the military, but among the society too in Japan, which, when the Americans actually put forward some conditions to the Japanese, the reason that a lot of Japanese were against those conditions was, why did we lose so many people in China already? What about all those deaths? So I think you can apply this kind of lens also to Ukraine. They will be proud of the heroes, the sacrifices that they gave, but they will say, like, why did they die? Did they die so our fates will be decided by the two superpowers again? Did they die because we are such a small nation that no one cares about us? And I think we talked about emotions, we talked about ethics, but I think that component that Ukraine should be able to decide its own future is there.
But I don't think that's a very fair comparison with 1930s Japan, right? And in fairness, actually, and I don't want to be a defendant of militarist pre-war Japan, but the Konoe cabinet made very clear to the Americans in the in fact, in 1940, you had a situation where the Japanese cabinet had made absolutely clear what the conditions for peace were, what their interests were, and how they would. And they used very cautious language, I'm sure you know this well, about how Japan would take every effort to defend its interests. And it's only when it gets to 1941 where finally you get slightly more Bolshevik rhetoric towards the United States. The United States ignored all that, trampled all over it, pushed Japan into a position where it could do little other, in many respects, other than lash out at the very least. And so you have, I think a closer comparison would actually be, maybe the United States should learn some of the lessons of history here,
right. You just gave me on a plate something perfect.
Okay.
I mean, yes, I give it to you that the comparison I brought up was not really good because Japan in the 30s was the aggressor state. It was the state expansionist state. So maybe you can't really compare that with Ukraine. But ultimately, the reason, and you're right to say that Japan was really trying not to fight with America until the very, very last, even until the last week before Pearl Harbor. They were ready to stop everything if there was one positive signal from Washington, from Ambassador Nomura, I think his name was, if I remember correctly. But going back to your point about power and politics, and ethics actually gives way to politics, to power in international politics. The reason why America was actually so arrogant with Japan, and you can actually go further and say America was very arrogant with Japan. You read the Hull note these days. It reads like an ultimatum. It was a diplomatic note by a diplomat, but it read like an ultimatum. And the reason they could afford to do that, because they knew, or they were at least hoping that the Japanese leadership, rational as it is, will not start a war against an economy that is 10 times, 15 times bigger than it is. And eventually the Japanese did it, not because they were hoping to win, but because they just needed to do something. They didn't want to go out of China, and they would never agree to those conditions that were in the Hull note. So, speaking of which, you might also say that, yes, Ukraine is also in a similar position, that Ukraine should finally kind of come to the table because it's weak. It doesn't have any power without the West. But ultimately, the U.S.
No. I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm suggesting that the point here is that Japan's position during the late 1930s and early 1940s was much more equivalent to Russia.
Yes.
So
yes.
You've got an aggressor.
That's my point too.
Russia also an aggressor. Japan an aggressor at the time. But you have an American establishment which, as you point out, is arrogant. And the kind of ultimatums that are issued. I mean, we saw it again from Donald Trump towards Hamas in Gaza. Like suddenly, after kind of creating one set of criteria for the ceasefire, then we have this ultimatum, and it's just like, oh, America has spoken. Everyone must toe the line.
But if you
talking about Russia here,
I just can't get your logic. Because your logic is you're saying that yes, Russia is weak. Russia is in the position of Japan in the late 1930s.
Equivalent.
So why would you pander to the weak? I mean, this goes back to the core of IR and diplomacy. Your opponent is in a weak position. You should take advantage of it and not give concessions to the opponent the way that Trump is doing.
But here's the difference. Here's where the comparison ends. Russia, relatively speaking, before 2022, right, before its invasion of Ukraine, was definitely, particularly you mentioned the economy, you're talking about an economy probably at the time the size of Spain or something like that, right? Sorry to have a go at Spain. Any country of a medium size within Europe with an equivalent economic position to Russia. The United States is the most powerful economy by far on the planet. So you've got a total imbalance, and yet you have a framework for engaging with Russia, which is Russia is weak, Russia are crappy. They're a gas station with a parliament or whatever the analogy is.
They're a hooligan with a knife.
A chap with a knife, right? So these are the kinds of sort of very essentialist, degrading, demeaning rhetoric that we used by the Americans towards Russia. What's happened since?
And those opinions haven't changed much, have they? Until Trump.
Right. But what has changed is the battlefield, right? The battlefield is now in a situation where Ukraine cannot win. Even if the United States, which it won't, was willing to launch a full-on invasion of the Donbass, which, maybe under those conditions we might see different. But basically, the battlefield is in a position where the United States and its allies in NATO cannot push Russia out of the Donbass. Almost all leading experts agree on this. So it is foolish to then start this pretense that, Ukraine are winning, it's only a matter of time, we only have to give them so much aid. No, we need to end this war, and we need to end it with clear rhetoric. I don't enjoy Donald Trump's two-faced, interest-seeking, dishonest approach, but I do appreciate that his administration have greater clarity than the one that went before it. And that might be an advantage in terms of ending or freezing
Do they
conflict.
have clarity, though? I mean, I don't want to drag this. I genuinely think that there is no clarity. But, I mean, we will talk about other things. We have to talk about other things. We need to move on. But one thing I'd like to say is, from a historical viewpoint, I would say people who've studied or people who've even witnessed, like people older than you and I, historians of the Cold War who've lived through the Cold War, especially American historians of the Cold War, well, I don't know, like John Lewis Gaddis or other renowned historians, Oddar and Westad. It would be really interesting to see what they say, because I would be really disappointed looking at what's happening to America's position in the world. Having taken everything that you've said, having agreed with most of what you said, yes, the war will have to end at some point, that the line should be drawn at some point. But the fact that a president who is so unlike any other president is really coming into this war in a position of power, U.S. is still speaking from a position of power. Is it? Kind of undermining America's position, let alone reputation, vis-a-vis a traditional rival whose tactic is very smart. This was the same in the Cold War period. try and divide the West as much as possible. This was the same in Stalin's period. Try and divide the capitalist world as much as possible. And then you can benefit from that division. And look at what's happening now in the world. As we speak, as we record this, the European leaders are meeting in Paris, I think.
Is it Paris?
Somewhere
Isn't it Germany?
in
Yeah,
Europe.
okay, yeah.
No, I'm not talking about the Munich conference.
Okay. Yeah.
This is an emergency conference called by Macron.
Right.
And
Yeah.
everyone will be there. Like British Prime Minister, or maybe some of the British leadership will be. Maybe the Foreign Minister will be there, Foreign Secretary. But Europe is really worried, and it is calling this emergency meeting. And do you think this is something that an American president, American leader, whatever his or her ideological beliefs, whatever their ideological stance, whatever their politics is, America, and everybody's used to this, has long been the leader of the so-called, I don't like these words, but so-called free world. And this is why I think there is disappointment in Europe. Yes, Europe should get its stuff together. Europe shouldn't really teach people how to unify, because Europe can't unite on even minor things. But leadership, there is a massive leadership vacuum. There is a massive division within the West, which will play into the hands of the so-called free world's rivals primarily.
Definitely. No doubt about that. I mean, my biggest concern here is that democracy is being trampled on and is becoming almost this unfashionable world.
Yeah.
Why is it that even here on campus, amongst large numbers of our students, there's a discussion about maybe democracy, should be replaced with a more authoritarian approach. Perhaps we should have in fact, recent polls have suggested that something like 30% of Gen Z actually believe that it would be more advantageous for the military to run Britain. This is a terrifying idea.
Yeah.
We're talking about open advocation of fascism, essentially.
Yes. I don't blame the young people. Not all of them are like that, obviously, but I think there are trends that we can talk about. I think the young people, especially the people who were teenagers, people who were born at the beginning of the century, who are now in their 20s, but were teenagers around, around the crisis, the big crisis. Obviously starts with Brexit, then with the COVID and the Ukraine war. But a few years before Brexit, and Jonathan Haidt has written a book about the anxious generation. It's called Anxious Generation. They are the anxious generation because about 2013, 2014 was the time when all of these teenagers got their first iPhones.
Yeah.
Or whatever other phones, Android phones. And they are an anxious generation. They are also a confused generation. They live in a world which you and I also live in, but we approach it from a completely different viewpoint. And you and I will probably never see the world in the same way they see it. And that world is confusing even for you and me, for people with PhDs. But you don't need a PhD. People with any practical wisdom about life, people with some experience would probably find it a bit easier to navigate that world. Even they struggle. This world is clearly made with all the social media, with all the various versions of truth, to confuse these young people.
Yeah.
And, it's tempting. It is tempting to... I have heard such views on different podcasts. I've read views about, for example, I wrote about this philosopher king, one of my heroes, Marcus Aurelius. And Marcus Aurelius was the definition of Socrates' philosopher king. In Plato's Republic, there is a dialogue in which Socrates actually talks about the need for the kings to study philosophy or philosophers to be kings. Otherwise, there will be no way to resolve the divisions.
Yeah, I think there's some people in my department that think philosophers should be kings.
Well, you know what? I don't disagree with them because at least there were examples. There was this example of Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor at the height of empire's might and territory. Rome had the most territory. Rome had the most prestige. In a similar way, probably, maybe if we live long enough, we will look back around this time, just before Trump came in. The United States being at the height of its economic and geopolitical might. And this man was a true philosopher, unlike the current president of of the United States. And when I wrote about this, some people actually came back and commented, it would actually be good to be ruled by a benevolent tyrant, by a benevolent dictator, someone who has the power, who has the highest concentration of power, as in more than in any democratic leader's hands, but who will be benevolent, who will not abuse that power.
Well, look at Singapore, for example, or I can't think of many examples. Singapore is the one that's most often held up as an example of a somewhat benevolent autocracy.
Oman is another one that
Oman
comes
definitely.
up.
There's a few, right? But you're kind of grappling around for names and definitions. And I just don't agree that you can have a benevolent dictator.
That's probably like a pipe dream, yeah.
Well, I think it's beyond a pipe dream. Like, it's just downright wrong to have somebody who, that for a start, that it's almost an oxymoron, right? You can't have a benevolent dictator because they wouldn't be a goddamn dictator, right? Yeah. That is not benevolent by the nature of it, as far as I'm concerned.
Corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Exactly.
Is that
well along those lines, right? Because you're obviously in a position, if you're benevolent, to empower other people. And can you think of any group of friends, team, colleagues, where you would rather have a dictator telling you all the time when you're allowed to come in and out of work, how long you have to be in the office, like all of these kinds of
those would be your your least, like your smallest worries.
Yeah, and I'm talking about minor stuff, right? Yeah. But let alone like who you should vote for, whether or not you should pursue
whether you should have the vote at all. Like if you're
exactly right.
Okay, right. This is a fascinating discussion. I think this is a good way for us to segue into the question of who the leader of the country, or what the leader of the country should serve.
Yeah.
Or what ideas. And I think we'll take a quick break here, and then we will return to this point about Trump, and use Trump's example in talking about how he's different from previous president, and whether some of the things that he's doing, some of the plans that he's proposing are actually serving the United States interests, because we started talking about interests, or something else. Okay, we're back now, and the question that I asked before the break was about Trump, but then it's linked to this position of we talked about the benevolent tyrant. I'm not saying Trump is a benevolent dictator or a tyrant, but
I'd say he's a malevolent tyrant.
But whatever he is, some of the things that he's proposing in trying to solve the biggest conflicts of the current world, current moment in history. For example, with Ukraine, there were reports that he was suggesting to the Ukrainians that the US should have concessions. This actually takes me back to 150 years ago, to gunboat diplomacy, to all kinds of neo or semi-colonialism, where a powerful nation comes and gets the resources of a less powerful nation in exchange for something. I think he's proposed also to turn Gaza into a resort.
Yeah.
So this kind of new transactionalism, if you like, if we can call it that, is quite interesting when it comes from the US president.
For sure. But it's also important to bear in mind that it might not be the worst possible outcome. That's not to say I'm advocating. I certainly don't agree or accept the idea that Gaza can just be had by the United States. The language that Donald Trump used about that is insane. He's saying that we won't buy it, that we don't have to buy it, there's nothing to buy. This is a war-torn... So we're talking about like...
Great impression.
Well, I mean, it's insane, right? The guy sat there saying he's going to have a country. It's like, so you don't just have a country. Yeah. You either go and take it by force, or somebody, donates it to you voluntarily. But in the case of Gaza, the terrifying thing is that compared to the history that place has had, for the last however long, almost any solution might be preferable. So we've got this moral dilemma where on the one hand, ethnically cleansing an entire population and forcibly displacing them and rehousing them somewhere else is obviously ethically, morally unacceptable and completely unreasonable. But then, and I think in fact it won't work because of the opposition to it. But then you have to bear in mind when you talk about transactionalism that if it leads to a preferable outcome, if one day, just for the sake of argument, you have...
What would be the preferable outcome for you, Ra?
Well, I don't know about for me personally, but I think for the majority of citizens of the planet, most people would like to see no war in Gaza, no war in Ukraine. And so the devil's advocate question
At any
here,
cost?
well, that's the question, right? But the cost of the war is huge.
To
the
whom?
cost of the war is specifically to Gazans and Ukrainians.
Yeah.
That's the point.
The
here.
interesting thing is, I think where we disagree is neither the Ukrainians nor the Gazans are being asked if you leave it to Trump. So if you leave it to Trump, again, you just quoted him in that very good impression. Do you think he's sparing a thought for what the Gazans think about this? He clearly doesn't care what the Ukrainians think.
Absolutely.
Because he also said that the Ukrainians won't be at the meeting. It will be a meeting between the United States and Russia. So,
but I just fear
you feel that's.
I feel that the reality is that look, Democrat administrations also don't give a shit about the populations that they deal with, especially if they're not American. But they put this gloss of democracy on that, right? And we can go back to, say, the Obama administration, and it's blinking in the face of Putin over Syria. This started all of this stuff in many respects, right? It was the unwillingness of Obama to really put his foot down, draw first interest-based politics any more than you do. But I do think they provide a little bit more clarity, and that's the kind of language that someone like Vladimir Putin can understand.
Yes, I mean I agree with you in that it's just at least it's unashamed. At least it is
unashamed, brazen.
Obviously, we need brazen and blatant, but we need to still see whether this thing bears any fruit. You remember in his first term how much comparable talk was there about his meetings with Kim Jong-un.
Yeah.
And a lot of people actually made the same argument that I was making earlier today before the break when I said, why would you give your weak opponent an opportunity to speak to you on equal terms? Because that's what people were criticizing Trump for engaging with Kim Jong-un. And you saw those things led nowhere. They were all kind of diplomatic exercises.
They might have done. And the United States had made no progress, or Japan, or China, or Russia really made any progress with North Korea for the best part of 4 decades, right? So in that respect, it didn't go anywhere. It was a failure, but it might have led to the normalization of North Korea. It might have led to a transformation. So in that respect, there's not that much lost. If the negotiations in the Ukraine break down, partly because of Trump's unwillingness to actually engage properly with the Ukrainians or to incorporate the Europeans for that much, who he also really has total disregard for in many respects. Nevertheless, if on the other hand, those negotiations develop and we see a frozen conflict, we see less people dying in horrible muddy trenches in the Donbass, maybe that's a win. Whereas endless supplying of weapons while talking about this in moral terms, I don't think that was getting them anywhere with Ukrainians or the Russians.
There's another fallacy there that a lot of, I think, you won't fall into this pit because you've studied IR. But a lot of the people talking about ending the war and let more people die, they forget that this won't be the end. If you freeze the conflict now, do you think Putin will just go away and say, okay, fine, let's be brothers again, let's shake hands and move on?
Of course not. Of course not.
He will come back, mate. He will come back.
You have to bear in mind that Putin doesn't trust Trump, right? People have this bogus, equally bogus misunderstanding that Trump and Putin are natural bedfellows, and that they couldn't wait to get back to being best buddies again as soon as Trump got
He
reelected.
didn't trump Biden either. Who does he trust among the Americans?
But that's the point. Everybody assumed that that Putin and Biden had this very adversarial relationship, but that Trump has somehow a more direct exchange with Putin because they're more similar character types or something along these lines, right? Putin doesn't trust Trump because
they are definitely not similar character types,
right,
I would
and
say,
it was also Trump that built up the military forces of the Ukraine prior to Russia's invasion, not Biden, not Obama. It was Donald Trump that did that. So there's no, under the Minsk Accords and all the rest of it, right? So Trump was really part of the creation of Putin's panic, shall we say, over Ukraine, right? So the point really is not that somehow you're going to get Putin trusting Trump and Trump trusting Putin, and therefore you won't see Putin trying to encroach. But what you might see is if the conflict is frozen and then you have the right kind of commitment to forces to defend what's left of Ukraine, then you might have a more stable scenario, because Russia has gained really what it wanted from the East, creating that land bridge and all the rest of it.
It wanted more, mate.
It wanted more, but it won't be able to take more if that's properly established. It will be far more difficult if the point is the Minsk Accords were abrogated not just by Russia but also by the European powers.
Yeah, I remain skeptical because there was one memorandum that was signed in over 30 years ago now in Budapest, so-called Budapest Memorandum, which was a prototype of that treaty that would protect Ukraine from Russia, and the guarantors were Britain and the US, and obviously that couldn't protect Ukraine. So I don't know. I remain skeptical. But talking about Trump's personality, I think Ukraine was and Zelensky personally were quite smart about it. They knew that if you said certain things, and I think Ishiba, we will briefly mention at the end of this, was also kind of, everybody thinks, or every leader thinks that if you say certain words to Trump, he will react in a certain, and he does sometimes. So I think Zelensky was quite smartly playing that card, and when he said Trump, US will not abandon us, Trump is a man of his word, those things. And equally, Putin was also doing it. Putin was saying, I admire Trump as a politician, those things. Ishiba.
Yeah.
Everybody dislikes him, or everybody seems to dislike him in Japan for some reason. I don't know. Maybe, yes, I agree, not the most charismatic politician, had some gaffes, had some things that he shouldn't have said, or maybe he shouldn't have eaten those
it's
snacks.
such a glorious
way on TV. But you need to give him credit, because the visit to Washington, which was a few days ago, went better for Japan than everybody expected. I think he also came very kind of dangerously close to saying, he came dangerously close to
saying anything. Yeah. In the end, he managed to do
But in the end, it seemed to work somehow on Trump.
Within reason. But at the same time, the United States is still going to place tariffs on Japan. You still haven't really seen much progress in the favor of Japan's steel, right? Which would have been a real result. So there's this idea that somehow Ishiba got out of it and was very diplomatically skillful because he managed to avoid questions about tariff imposition and economic warfare and all this kind of stuff. And the guy is not incompetent. I've watched Ishiba since I was in graduate school, when he used to be defense minister. I've seen how he's reinvented himself and finally, after so long, got himself in the top seat. But I don't know if he's really fighting Japan's corner. We've argued about this before, but I still feel like Japan is playing, fiddle to the American tune on most issues. Which actual concrete outputs or achievements has he achieved through that meeting? Yeah,
you're right. Expectations were quite low. I think the fact that he didn't make a big mistake is already seen as kind of success.
It's pretty low bar, right?
Yeah, pretty low bar.
If you're the prime minister of the world's third or fourth largest economy, and success is seen as not making a major success when you meet one of your closest allies, That's a pretty low bar. And it tells you something about Japanese prime ministers more than it does about the US.
Exactly, and he won't be alone in making. I mean, he didn't make a gaffe, but there were more hilarious gaffes in the past. And
for sure,
we don't have time for those.
We
But finally, again, on the question of Japan and the US in the formal kind of academic part or world affairs part of our podcast, before we move on to football, I'd like to ask you about what happens to Okinawa. Again, going back to the question, you're fresh back from Okinawa. Last episode we recorded while you were still there. You did give us your impressions about how Okinawa has changed. But I have one question to you. Feel free to expand on it if you want. But the question is, will Trump's advent mean that America will push Japan for not only for tariffs, but also for more concessions for their bases and for their boots on the ground in Okinawa? Will Japan find that they will have to pay more or give more concessions just because of Trump?
Quite possibly. The last time Trump was in power, he demanded... So just to give people a bit of context, Okinawans, or I should say really the Japanese taxpayer, foots the bill largely for the stationing of American forces on Okinawa, right? Military forces bases. So this is called the sympathy budget or Omoiyari Yosan. And Trump demanded that this was raised by something like 4 times the amount. And as it is, there's already obvious dissatisfaction. If you're in Okinawa and you're in Okinawa, or if you're an Okinawan, that you have to pay, essentially, to have troops that you may not want stationed on your island, creating a target for all adversaries and militarizing the islands. You have to pay for that with your tax dollars. And you're now having a president come in and saying, hey, you're not paying enough.
Yeah, External Revenue Service he wants to establish.
It's pretty scandalous, right, in a lot of ways. So, yeah, I think that's pretty likely. But what you also have to bear in mind is that there's a massive gap between general opinion on Okinawa and general opinion on mainland Japan. And at the moment, I think we're in a moment where the security environment can be described and constantly is described in Japan as more severe. I'm not sure if it really is, but that's how it's described and it's how it's being framed. And so there is this alignment. It's a subtle misalignment, but it's actually an alignment mostly between Japanese conservatives within the political establishment and US Republicans. And both sides, in a way, would like more money invested in Japan's defense forces, but for slightly different reasons. On the American side, they would like to have Japan pay for their front-facing power projection in the Western Pacific. On the Japanese side, they would like a justification for greater interoperability with the US so that they can actually, paradoxically or ironically, have greater independence and a more robust defense posture. So those things, while they're aligned, will mean squashing Okinawa's interests.
Yeah, we talked about Japan becoming a more normal country on
exactly.
the last podcast. So, yes, for various reasons.
But maybe there's, I mean, if I throw it back to you, I mean, don't you think there's another whole kind of candidate in the room here, which is China? And if we go back through history, China has a very close relationship with Okinawa.
Yeah.
It's part of China's worldview. Is this not an opportunity for China, whilst Trump is in power, to actually seize these 4 years to try and extend its kind of ancient historical influence in the region?
Maybe subtly. I mean, you tell me about all the ancestral graves in the Fujian province or all the traditional roots, traditional links between what was then the Ryukyu kingdom. Liu Qiu, I think.
Exactly.
In
Even
Chinese
the pronunciation is maneuvered.
And China, and it's 150 years ago exactly. 1874 was the beginning of, some historians call this the beginning of Japan's mimetic imperialism. Mimetic in the sense that Japan was trying to follow the lead or the example of other colonial powers, which would come on ships and really kind of put pressure on weaker countries or smaller countries. China was never smaller than Japan, but China at the time, Qing China, was in a very weak position. And the Japanese used the murder of several Okinawan fishermen by the locals in what was then called Formosa, Taiwan, to really resolve the issue of Okinawa. And In the next few years, Okinawa then officially becomes Japanese prefecture because Qing is too weak, too poor, or too distracted to deal with what once was its vassal kingdom. I mean, strictly speaking, it considered Ryukyu Kingdom its vassal, but Ryukyu Kingdom also had very strong relations with Satsuma domain in the Edo period Japan. So its position was very fluid. And you would think historically that position was quite beneficial for Ryukyu Kingdom because they were traders between the regions.
Ryukyu leaders of the time actually begged the Satsuma officials to allow them, even post. So once there was the transition to Meiji rule, it became Okinawa prefecture. There was this petitioning of the Japanese authorities to allow them to continue paying tribute to China.
Yes, just because that tribute was a symbolic thing. I mean, those who've studied Chinese history or East Asian history will know it was a ritual. It was kind of a diplomatic ritual where the value of the goods weren't so important. The goodwill was important, and China's reputation as this benevolent power that allows smaller nations borrow from it and allows smaller nations to benefit from its largesse, to benefit from its culture, to benefit from its bigger economy and its artisans and its porcelain makers and everything. That reputation, I think, you can see some of the flavors of that in current China's policy.
Absolutely. And current Chinese rhetoric. So we
too,
hear that evoked
Yeah.
when Chinese leaders are now talking about Okinawa.
Yeah.
And this is causing a kind of mini panic among the Japanese establishment.
Yeah, just to give an example, Chinese leaders like to emphasize that China never had any colonies.
Yeah.
China never invaded other foreign countries, which is not strictly true,
But it's a deliberate, jab at Imperial Japan.
At Imperial Japan and other imperial nations which had been traditionally China's rivals or China's enemies, and which once again, so the tables have turned, find themselves on the opposite side of China. So I think on this beautiful note, we can take another very short break and then delve into the question of football. Thank you.
So, football. We're not going to talk about Chinese football because there's not much to talk about.
Well, unless you talk about people who... I mean, China for a brief period was Saudi Arabia, wasn't it?
It was.
Everybody wanted to go there.
You remember people like Oscar, a Brazilian player, getting, I forget what it was, like...
Shanghai something.
And he was getting paid $500,000 a year or more than that even. Huge, crazy salary.
Great-grandchildren can live in comfort
Probably,
with that
right?
money.
Yeah. Xi Jinping talking about how China was going to win the World Cup by 2050. Good luck with that.
Yes. Good luck with that.
And suddenly you see the bottom fall out of it. So we could talk about Saudi football, but I'd also like to kind of talk a little bit about Japan's footballer, as we often do. We've skirted around the topic. This week, Sherzod, we saw probably one of the greatest goals ever scored by a Japanese player in the Premier League.
Oh, it's definitely a contender for goal of the season in the Premier League. Whether scored by a Japanese player or not, but yes, I would agree with you. I have watched and rewatched the highlights. I didn't watch the game itself. We're talking about Brighton versus Chelsea. 3-0. Brighton obviously playing at home on Saturday. What was the date?
15th.
15th.
But what's striking about the goal, what I wanted to ask you about it, is because at the risk of being provocative, there is a stereotype about Japanese players that they're small, quick, hardworking, technically gifted on the ground, but that they lack a certain kind of awareness of different types of football and a certain kind of footballing brain, and this is why the Japanese national team doesn't do well. But the goal itself, not only was it unbelievably skillful, it was from a long ball.
Yes, absolutely. It was so un-Japanese, if I may say this. Yeah, because there is this... I mean, Japanese players are easily compartmentalized by the Western pundits as, yes, having low center of gravity, very technically astute, very quick, usually almost always coming in from the wings. You remember Nagatomo,
Even Tomiyasu.
Tomiyasu is a very strong defender. Maybe Tomiyasu and Yoshida are one of the first players who start to break that mold, you know.
But even Tomiyasu, he's still in a wing position, right?
He's in a wing position.
It's true, actually, Yoshida. Yeah, Maya Yoshida, definitely different kind of player. But still, sorry, go on.
He's right. I mean, you look at Maeda Daisen. He looks also quite different. I mean, his physique and everything. But I think that stereotype is still quite strong. And when Mitoma came to Brighton, when everybody started talking about him, I also remember thinking, oh, he's also of a very similar type of a player, you know, who is not very big, not very strong physically, very quick, very technical, but kind of usually is a facilitator.
Yeah.
Will score once in a while because he's very direct, but he's not one of the players whom I would expect to score.
Right.
That goal was very Zlatan.
Yeah.
If you ask me. That goal was very Inzaghi. That goal was very... Because, you know, if you can watch the replays on YouTube, I think, the way that he... his
Other
first
platforms
touch,
are available.
Yes. His first touch. The way he then rounds the defender. And the way he... I mean, don't listen to me. I'm not a striker. Listen to Alan Shearer's analysis of it. Alan Shearer, one of the greatest Premier League strikers. And the way then he beats the keeper. That goal is an absolute marvel.
It is.
And for us with Rob, the question is Mitoma completely breaking that mold of this typical Japanese player? Has he adapted to the Premier League enough? Apparently he has, in producing that kind of a very unusual goal for a Japanese player to score, and can others also follow him?
Yeah, exactly. I think, if you go back as far as Nakata, right?
Hidetoshi.
Yeah, Hidetoshi Nakata. I mean, he really broke the mold in lots of ways as a Japanese player. And we're going back, a long way with that, best part of 20 years. So maybe this is a strange conversation to be having, given how many different Japanese players have been there.
Honda Keisuke.
Right, yeah.
He broke the mold with his free kicks.
Yes. And then you mentioned...
He was a free kick specialist.
Yoshida, Maya, a bunch of other players. Tomiyasu, as you say, he's big and powerful in some ways. But I think that the real difference with Kaoru Mitoma is that we've finally seen a player that, in one sense, like you're saying, looks like they fit the stereotypical Japanese player mold, but actually seems to be operating in a totally different mind space. Like in terms of his footballing brain, there's a genius there that we didn't see from previous players. That if you, as I have, and you've probably done similarly, but certainly I spent quite a long time playing football in both the UK and Japan. And when you play football in Japan,
not as much as you.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
I do love my football. But I was always, like in Japan, I was always stereotyped as being a typical kind of, no skills but hardworking British player.
I would disagree with that.
Who would run around like endlessly, heading and chasing.
Your skill in sliding tackles and bruising your knees to a bloody pulp. I have seen that many times.
Nose and anything else. Yeah, for sure. But the point being that if you play a lot in Japan, you do see this very kind of repetitive pattern of football, right? Yeah. And that's it's not necessarily
inspired by one Spanish club.
Yeah. In fact, one Spanish player, I think we could say.
Yeah,
if I heard the word Iniesta one more time spoken in Japanese football.
Well, Iniesta is well liked in Japan.
Oh, he's adored. Yeah. But the point really just being that you've got a specific style of play, and every team, if not every team, most teams in Japan are quite comparable in the type of football philosophy they have.
Yeah.
But Mitoma seems to have broken out of that mold. So I think this might be the kind of final moment.
List Mitoma's un-Japanese characteristics apart from the strength that we mentioned.
Well, we mentioned strength as one of them. Strength compared to his size, but it's also vision. It's vision, isn't it? Like the fact that he makes that run, right? He understands that somebody's going to hammer the ball long, straight down the pitch. It's a long ball that wouldn't be out of place in 1980s Wimbledon.
Yeah.
And yet it's being used by a team that has a reputation for very skillful, varied attacking football. And Mitoma embodies everything that's good about Brighton Football Club at the moment. Even though I'm not a Brighton fan.
I was very, very, very surprised because for me, again, besides that Japanese kind of player mold, Mitoma is a very kind of player who plays in triangles.
Yeah.
Like if you think in how Brighton play, and especially in the previous manager's tenure, De Zerbi's tenure, he would be one of those, give and go, link up player who would often be the one who is coming in from the left and either shooting directly or squaring it to someone.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that you mentioned also is his directness.
Yeah.
I think he's very direct. And being direct in this age of football, the Pep Guardiola kind of age of football, where you never, if you can pass, you never shoot, kind of.
Never dribble, never shoot.
Yeah.
You just pass.
Yeah,
You just keep passing.
In that mold of the contemporary game, I think players who are very direct, and of course you need to be very quick, can cause chaos.
Yeah.
And one example from my own long-suffering team is Garnacho.
Right.
And you look at Manchester United, and the less said about Manchester United, the better, especially after yesterday's result against Tottenham. But the only player who could cause anything, despite the fact that we were tearing our hair off he missed an absolute sitter, but despite that, he was the only player who we believed could create anything, simply because he's very direct. He just goes at the defenders. He doesn't know, he doesn't think, I often use the term headless chicken.
Yeah.
But then when he does that, especially when he does that in the 70th minute, 80th minute, when the defenders are really tired.
But it's a fine balance, isn't it? Because it's so professionalised football now. And we talked about this before, but I think, there's a globalisation to the game, which is making it strangely formulaic across countries, because everybody watches football everywhere. So if you get a slightly different kind of player, say, for example, like you say, more direct, that creates something that teams aren't ready for.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if it goes wrong, it looks terrible, because every team is so professionalised. Everybody knows what position they're supposed to be in, who they're supposed to be covering.
Yeah.
Everyone plays out from the bloody back every time.
Yes.
We talked about this before. So that's why you've got, look at the Championship, and you're thinking, if you were to predict who's going to get promoted from the Championship, other than the top four, how would you pick a team? This is so similar.
It's very hard.
And they all play like each other.
I think I noticed that change when I first watched Burnley play out from the back. And Burnley and Southampton were just absolutely hell-bent.
Yeah.
I think it probably became Southampton's downfall. It will probably become Manchester United's downfall when we play in the Championship next season. But this stubbornness of these new breed or new crop of managers.
Yeah.
You remember Russell Martin, how stubborn he was, how he didn't change his formation, how he insisted that they always play out. And Burnley, I remember Burnley. For me, Burnley still is a Sean Dyche Burnley.
Sure.
And when you watch these teams, which only 10, 15 years ago were just hoofing it, or were just, crossing and hoping that one of the very tall defenders will connect with their head. Now that you barely see any crosses, and anytime there's a cross, somehow Arne Slot, the arch rivals manager, talked about Manchester United being a long ball team, which was which added insult to injury.
I think that is a little bit of gamesmanship.
Being long ball is seen as this, not very good these days.
There's got to be a space here, right, for a new style of football, because I just think we've seen so much of this kind of Pep Guardiola inspired short passing. Why is it that, for example, Man City have finally come totally unhinged? Is that
lots of factors.
Losing the best player in the world obviously doesn't help, but
best player in the world.
Well, he got a Ballon d'Or.
Arguably.
Yeah.
Arguably, lots of people disagreed with that. I didn't specifically disagree with that.
I didn't vote for him personally.
Because I think Rodri is one of those rare breed of players who are not absolute a-holes.
Yeah. And also...
Maybe scratch this. But
well, no, I think keep it. It's a fair point. And
because he's quite a likable guy. He's not one of those guys, very divisive guys who just boil the blood, of the rival fans.
Seemingly low ego or limited ego, and yet wins every time he plays.
Yeah.
Basically, when Man City play in the league, Rodri, they win.
Reminds me Michael Carrick. When we had Michael Carrick, probably you could argue that Michael Carrick wasn't as skilled as him, but Michael Carrick was as important for that trophy-winning Manchester United team
Yeah.
as Rodri, because I remember when Carrick wasn't there, we would really struggle,
Right, yeah.
like that. So okay, I mean, enough talk about football formations and tactics. Let's talk about Championship. And Championship is really interesting because we will also come back to the Premier League after this. Championship is really interesting because the top 3 and top 4 is constantly changing and revolving.
But there's also, what's interesting is that top 4 is its own little club. So you've got 4 teams, 3 of which very recently came down from the Premier League, and they're in a different class. Which are Sunderland, Burnley, Leeds, and Sheffield United.
Okay.
Those 4 are way ahead.
Sunderland didn't come back from...
It's true. I said 3 of the 4.
Yeah, 3 of... Okay, good.
Sunderland obviously are a rising power, but still, it's very noticeable that you have almost all very recently relegated teams at the top, and they're way clear. And then in the Premier League, apart from Wolves, who, if we're lucky, might get relegated...
If you're lucky, I don't care much about Wolves.
But the rest, they're the teams that literally the 3 teams that got promoted last year.
Okay, but you also notice the fact that you will probably have looked at the table and from position 6, where your team is currently at,
best of the rest,
to about the 15th.
Yeah.
They are separated by only a few points, 7, 8 points.
Yeah, 7 points for 10 teams. It's crazy.
Which means like unpredictability will remain a factor, because like who of those? Because I mean, those of you who don't know how the Championship promotion works, the top 2 teams are promoted automatically, and the
next 4, right?
Next 4 form this so-called playoffs, out of which only 1 team can progress out of 4, which then becomes a battle. And usually they link up the 3rd and the 6th and the 4th and the 5th.
Yeah.
And
which is also noticeable because last year, then it was 2 teams. Obviously, Southampton did get promoted. Leeds lost out, but Southampton and Leeds played in the final, and there was a gulf in class between Southampton and West Brom, and particularly between Leeds, who annihilated Norwich, easily. They look like a Premier League team playing against a Championship team, which is ultimately what they probably might be next season. And so the gap between a team like Norwich, a mediocre Championship team, and
don't forget where you are. Okay.
It is, though. It's a huge
the gap is massive. We talked about this also on the last episode, because that Southampton team, you're talking about how strong it was in the playoffs. Leeds, the one that beat Norwich with such confidence, then ends up losing out to Southampton, and then Southampton comes to the Premier League, and it's the last, absolutely the worst Premier League team in this season. I mean, coming from a Manchester United fan whose team is in the 15th, this shouldn't really but anyway, don't listen to me. Anyway, still, the gap, the gulf between the Premier League and the Championship is just crazy. Who is going to be promoted? I mean, I'm giving you the impossible job.
It's only going to be one of those 4 teams. I should say 2 of the 4.
So no hope for playoffs?
No hope for West Brom, no hope for Blackburn, no hope for any of the gaggle of teams.
No
that
optimism?
Are behind them.
No hope, just booze and madness?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it could happen, right? But the point is, the playoffs are home and away.
Yeah.
Which give, and they're also, the Championship is a massive, mammoth 46 game season.
And the final is played at the Wembley.
Yes, it is. Yeah. But after all this, like the season in the Championship, no team, even the top teams, can go on winning endlessly. They always lose or draw one after a while, just because there's so many games.
They will have injuries.
Exactly. But for the playoffs, you've got 2 games where the entirety, all of the resources, all of the money, all of the attention is poured onto those games, and it's home and away. And so if you've got such a big gap between those teams that are yo-yoing up and down and the rest, then there's very little hope that one of those smaller teams can do it now. It's not impossible. We saw Luton, but look at Luton now, bottom of the Championship.
Good answer. You ducked that unpredictability, difficult, impossible question.
Justified it.
Premier League, I mean,
that's for you to answer,
the less said about the Premier League, the better, I guess.
Will we see a totally different Manchester United next season?
No. I shouldn't say this because this sounds very gloomy, but I have psychologically made my peace with the inevitable truth that Manchester United are not coming back in the next 5 years. If we're lucky, we will still challenge for the top 4 after about 5-6 years. It will be 5 or 6 years of wilderness in which Manchester United will be what it is now, a mediocre, mid-table Premier League team, will not be probably relegated, but will not really do anything remarkable.
But this is the biggest club in the world.
Once the biggest club in the
So
world.
what's going on?
So many problems. We can probably have like just one episode talk, and I'll be happy to do it. One episode talking about the problems of Manchester, and the problem is actually, unfortunately for us, not just the players and not just the manager. Problems are actually way bigger than that, and those bigger problems are the real reason why the club is in a situation it is. Everything that you remember about Manchester United, rich club, can buy anyone, always finishes in the top 3, always wins a trophy, Fergie time, forget all of that. Forget all of that. I don't want to be too gloomy, but I think every season in the last 3-4 seasons, I've told myself, this is the absolute deep end. This is the absolute rock bottom, and it's impossible to really go below this. And each season, we've gone below
Expectations
that. We've
are
actually
exceeded.
hit that bottom, and we've actually gone through it. So, the less spoken about Manchester United, the better. One final question about Premier League to you. Liverpool have been really good, unfortunately for us, but the last few games, I didn't watch the highlights of yesterday's game when they won against Wolves. You will have enjoyed that. But it looks like Liverpool are losing steam. Any hope for our friends from muesli eating, from Guardian reading,
Arsenal,
North London friends?
I think just enough hope so that we can all enjoy when they finally fail at the end of the season.
I don't know. Like you're a perfect neutral here. Who would you rather won the league?
Honestly,
Yeah,
Notts Forest.
Yes, I mean Notts Forest. Yes, I would probably not mind that. Yeah, but I guess that's probably not going to happen.
So, as converted Forest fans, maybe we should wrap this up before we get
Wrap
too
this up.
ridiculous.
Yes, this has been quite a long podcast, but I think we covered quite a lot of things. So thank you very much. Our next episode, we will have a guest. So it won't be just these two blokes chatting to each other. If you haven't subscribed on YouTube, please do. Our audience is quite small, but we are trying to grow it. And please click the like button, because that will help everyone who is interested in these topics, the topics that we discuss, find this podcast too. So thank you very much. And until the next one. Thank you, Ra.
Thank you, Shehzad.
This podcast has been produced with support from the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of East Anglia, UEA. The hosts are grateful to the UEA media production team. Technical assistance has been kindly provided by the technicians at the UEA Media Suite, who have also engineered and edited this episode. The views expressed in this podcast belong solely to those who express them and do not represent the views of the university or its affiliates.